The afternoon sun was shining softly across the quiet town. Small shops lined the main road, their windows filled with decorations for the coming weekend. People were walking lazily along the sidewalks, some with grocery bags in hand, others chatting on benches. Among them, a woman in her late 30s drove carefully through the street in a black luxury car. Her expression was calm, her movements graceful, and her eyes scanned the road with focus. She was not just any traveler passing through. Behind her composed look was a woman of great responsibility, someone who had worked her way up to one of the highest positions in the country. Yet, here, in this small town, no one knew her true identity. To the people around, she appeared to be another visitor, perhaps a businesswoman on her way to meet someone or simply someone who liked to drive in peace. She had chosen this route because it was quiet. Away from the loud cities, she felt she could breathe here. The air smelled fresher, the sound of birds seemed louder, and the streets moved slower. But she also knew that small towns carried their own kind of watchfulness. Strangers stood out. Cars that didn't belong drew eyes. And sometimes, those eyes carried questions not spoken aloud. As she drove, she noticed a police car parked at the corner. The officer inside sat back, watching the road with a stern expression. She had trained herself over the years to observe people closely, and one look at him told her everything she needed to know. His stare wasn't neutral, it was sharp, heavy, and suspicious. It wasn't the look of someone ensuring safety. It was the look of someone searching for a reason to control. She kept her eyes forward, her hands steady on the wheel, and continued driving, not letting her thoughts show on her face. Within a minute, she saw flashing lights in her mirror. The police car had pulled out behind her, and the sound of a siren broke the calm of the afternoon. She slowed her car, pulled to the side, and parked neatly. She rolled down her window and rested her hands where they could be seen, calm and patient. The officer stepped out. His uniform was pressed, his boots heavy against the road. His hand rested casually near his belt, and his eyes narrowed as he approached her. His expression carried authority, but there was something more, a kind of eagerness, as if he was waiting for the moment to exercise power. "License and registration," he said sharply, without greeting. She gave a polite nod. "Of course, officer." Her voice was calm, almost warm. She handed him the documents without hesitation. He glanced at them, then looked back at her. "Where are you headed?" "Just passing through," she answered. His eyes studied her face carefully, then moved down to her clothes and the car she was driving. The frown between his eyebrows deepened. To him, she did not belong in this picture. He tapped the papers against his palm and leaned slightly closer. "You from around here?" he asked, his tone less like a question and more like a test. "No," she replied softly. The officer nodded slowly, as if confirming a thought in his head. He looked at her car again, then back at her face. He didn't return her license immediately. Instead, he folded his arms and stood with a smirk. "Strange to see someone like you driving a car like this, through a town like ours." The words were loaded, but she did not respond to the challenge. She had heard such lines before in her life, and she knew that silence sometimes spoke louder than argument. She simply waited, her gaze steady, her breathing even. Her calmness unsettled him. He was used to people fumbling, rushing to explain themselves, or showing fear when pulled over. Instead, this woman sat still, respectful, but not weak. That made him uneasy, and in his mind, uneasy quickly turned into defiance. "Step out of the car," he ordered. She didn't move quickly, nor did she argue. She unbuckled her seat belt, opened the door, and stepped out gracefully. She stood on the side of the road, her posture upright, her eyes level with his. The officer circled her car, tapping the roof with his fingers as he walked around it slowly. "Nice car. Must have cost a fortune." His voice was casual, but his tone carried an edge. He stopped in front of her again. "How exactly did you get it?" "I worked hard," she answered simply. That response, spoken without hesitation, only fueled his suspicion. He tilted his head, looking at her as though he could uncover her entire life by sheer force of will. But the longer he stared, the more he realized he was not in control of this exchange. Something about her presence felt different, stronger, firmer, and unshaken by his tactics. He leaned closer. "You know, people don't just drive through here in cars like this unless they've got something to hide." Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Or maybe they're just passing through, like I said." For the first time, his jaw tightened. He wasn't used to polite resistance that didn't break. He held her documents in his hand, but they no longer gave him the confidence he thought they would. Instead, he felt a growing need to push harder, to regain control of the situation. She, on the other hand, remained calm. Inside her mind, she was fully aware of what was happening. She knew men like him, men who mistook authority for power, who believed intimidation was a tool of respect. But she had also learned that patience was the strongest shield. She had dealt with threats far greater than this officer standing in front of her. And though she could reveal her true identity at any moment, she chose not to. Not yet. She wanted to see how far he would go. She wanted to understand his character, not because she feared him, but because she knew moments like these revealed truths that no report or complaint ever could. People showed who they really were when they thought no one could hold them accountable. The officer paced slowly in front of her, tapping her license against his palm. "You're not telling me everything," he said finally. "And I don't like being lied to." Her eyes softened slightly. "I haven't lied, officer. I've told you exactly the truth. I'm passing through." Her steady words, spoken without tremor, echoed in the quiet air. For a moment, even the birds seemed silent. The officer's smirk faltered, and in that tiny crack of expression, she saw it clearly, insecurity hiding beneath the uniform. He didn't know who she was, but his instincts told him she wasn't someone ordinary. And that thought unsettled him more than anything. The woman glanced briefly at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the town. She took a slow breath, not out of fear, but out of calm readiness. She had been in countless high-stakes moments before. This was just another one. What she didn't know yet was how far the officer was willing to take this dangerous game. But one thing was certain: the more he pushed, the closer he was walking toward a truth that would shatter his false sense of power. And as the wind carried the quiet hum of the town around them, the stage was being set for a revelation that neither he nor the people watching from behind their curtains would ever forget. The woman stood quietly on the roadside, the soft evening light brushing against her face. She seemed calm, but inside her mind she was carefully observing every small detail: the officer's tone, his movements, even the way his eyes shifted when she answered his questions. Years of training had taught her how to read people quickly, and everything about him told her that he was not interested in safety or duty. He was chasing control. The officer still held her license in his hand. He spun it between his fingers slowly, as though to remind her that he had the upper hand. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You think you can just pass through here without answering me properly? People like you don't drive cars like this unless you're hiding something. And if you are," he let the sentence hang, his eyes narrowing, "you'll regret it." She stayed silent. Her silence was not weakness, it was measured, thoughtful, a silence that allowed him to reveal more of himself with every word. "Do you have money?" he asked suddenly. His tone was sharper now, less like a question and more like an order. She looked him in the eye. "I work for what I have." "That's not what I asked." He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "If you don't want trouble, maybe you should make things easier. You understand?" Her mind registered the shift immediately. This was no longer about suspicion. It was turning into blackmail. She had seen this pattern before, though not always from a man in uniform. It was the same hunger for advantage, the same attempt to turn fear into currency. "What exactly do you mean, officer?" she asked gently, though her words carried quiet steel. He smirked, leaning close enough that his shadow fell across her. "I mean you give me something to make me look the other way. Otherwise, I'll find a reason to take you in." For a moment, the street around them felt too quiet. A dog barked faintly in the distance, and the leaves rustled in the evening breeze, but all of it seemed far away. She stood completely still, her face calm, though her heart ached at the thought of how many others may have stood in this very position without the power to resist. "And if I refuse?" she asked softly. The officer's smirk deepened, but his voice grew darker. "Then maybe you won't make it out of this town. Maybe no one will even know what happened to you." The words hung in the air like a shadow, heavy and threatening. To anyone else, such a statement might have frozen their spirit. But to her, it only confirmed what she already knew: this man had let his authority corrupt him completely. He wasn't protecting the community. He was preying on it. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Her training reminded her to stay calm, to never let anger or fear lead the moment. "Are you threatening me, officer?" she asked carefully, her tone even, her gaze unwavering. He chuckled, as though amused by her calmness. "Call it whatever you want. But around here, I decide who stays safe and who doesn't. If you don't want things to get ugly, you'll do what I say." The woman studied him, her eyes soft but unflinching. She knew that revealing her true identity now would end this instantly. A single flash of her badge would silence him, replace his arrogance with fear, and summon accountability. But she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she chose to let him continue, because every word he spoke painted the picture of his true character more clearly than any file ever could. "I don't carry cash," she said finally, testing his response. His smirk wavered, then turned sharp. "Then you better figure out another way to make it worth my time." His tone had grown colder, his confidence dripping like oil. He tapped her license against the side of his palm. "I can put you in the system right now. One phone call, one report, and you're sitting in a cell for the night or longer. Who's going to question me? I'm the law here." She tilted her head slightly, almost as though she was curious. "And what if people do question you?" His eyes narrowed. "No one questions me. Not here. And certainly not when it's your word against mine." He stepped even closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You wouldn't last a minute if I decided you were a problem." Inside, she felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. Sadness because this was the very corruption she had dedicated her life to fighting, an officer who used his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. But resolve, because she knew his downfall was coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. "I see," she said calmly. Her tone gave away nothing. The officer leaned back, mistaking her calmness for hesitation. He felt as if he was winning. "Good. Then maybe you're starting to understand how things work. So, what's it going to be? Do you want to walk away quietly, or do you want to make me your problem?" She looked at him, her eyes steady and calm, her voice almost gentle. "I believe the truth always shows itself, officer." Her words confused him for a second. He laughed, but there was a hint of unease behind the sound. He shook his head and stuffed her license into his pocket. "You're not going anywhere until I say so." She didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply waited. And in that silence, he continued to reveal himself, unaware that every step he took was pulling him closer to a cliff he couldn't see. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. The officer tried to maintain his show of power, but the longer she stood there calmly, the more frustrated he became. He wanted her to flinch, to beg, to show fear, but she gave him none of it. Finally, he leaned closer again, lowering his voice dangerously. "I'll give you one last chance. Do what I say, or I'll make sure you disappear. And no one will even ask why." The words were like ice in the evening air. Yet, instead of fear, she felt clarity. This was the moment she had been waiting for. He had gone as far as he could, revealing the full extent of his corruption. He believed his power was absolute, his threats unshakable. He had no idea how wrong he was. She straightened slightly, her presence quiet but commanding. Her eyes met his without blinking, her voice soft yet unmovable. "Be very careful with the choices you make tonight, officer. They may decide your future more than mine." He froze, caught off guard by the weight of her words. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't expected from her: authority. Real authority, the kind that couldn't be shaken by threats or intimidation. He didn't understand it yet, but deep down, a sliver of doubt began to creep into his chest. And as the evening shadows grew longer, the air between them thick with tension, he didn't realize that the power he thought he held was already slipping away, piece by piece, into her hands. The officer stood only a few feet away from the woman, his arms folded, his eyes sharp with false confidence. He believed he had control of the situation. In his mind, she was just another passerby who had no choice but to obey his demands. Yet, something about her calmness unsettled him. She did not beg, she did not panic, and she did not show fear. Her stillness was unlike anything he had seen before, and though he tried to cover it, he could feel an uncomfortable doubt growing inside him. The woman, on the other hand, knew exactly what she was doing. Every second she remained patient was a second in which the officer revealed more of his character. He had already threatened her, already spoken words that could ruin him if repeated in the right ears. But still, he had no idea who stood before him. To him, she was just another woman he could control. To her, he was an example of the very corruption she had spent years working to uncover. The sky above them was darkening, the soft glow of twilight spreading across the quiet town. The road was empty, except for the two of them and the police car parked behind hers, its lights still flashing red and blue against the windows of nearby shops. Curtains in some of the houses shifted slightly, as though neighbors were peeking through, but no one dared to step outside. Everyone knew this officer's temper. No one wanted to become his target. "Are you going to do what I said, or do you want me to make life harder for you?" the officer asked finally, breaking the heavy silence. His tone was sharper now, his patience thinning. The woman tilted her head slightly, her calm eyes meeting his without flinching. "You seem very sure of yourself, officer." "I am," he snapped quickly. "People like you don't last long if they cross me." Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "And what if the person you're crossing is not who you think she is?" For a moment, his smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. But arrogance quickly returned. "You're bluffing," he said firmly, though the confidence in his voice had dipped just slightly. "You don't scare me." She took a slow step forward, her movements steady and deliberate. Her hands remained visible, open and calm. With quiet grace, she reached into her pocket, not rushing, not dramatic, but with the kind of certainty that comes from years of authority. The officer's eyes followed her hand carefully, his own moving instinctively closer to his belt. But then he froze. In her hand was not money, not an excuse, but a badge. The polished surface caught the fading light of the sun, gleaming with unmistakable clarity. She held it with confidence, her eyes locked firmly on his. The officer blinked, his body stiffening. His eyes darted between her face and the badge, reading the words etched into it. His breath caught, and for the first time that evening, the smirk fell completely from his face. Federal Bureau of Investigation, she said softly, her tone calm but carrying the weight of command. Director. Her words hit him like thunder. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hands, which moments earlier had rested near his belt with arrogance, now hung awkwardly at his sides. His confident stance crumbled into disbelief. You're, he stammered, unable to finish. Yes, she said simply, her voice steady. The director. The silence that followed was heavy. The officer's eyes widened as the truth sank in. The woman he had threatened, blackmailed, and tried to intimidate was not a powerless passerby. She was one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, someone who commanded respect across the nation. His face paled, his body trembling slightly. He took a step back without realizing it, as though distance could undo what he had done. His voice, once sharp and filled with false authority, now stumbled. I didn't know you didn't care to know, she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. You saw me as someone you could threaten. You saw me as someone without power. And you used your badge to try and take advantage of me. Her words were not loud, but they carried the weight of undeniable truth. The officer's lips parted, but no excuse would form. He could feel the walls closing in around him, every decision of the past hour pressing down on him like a mountain. Please, he muttered, his arrogance now gone, replaced by desperation. She held his gaze firmly, her expression unreadable. What you've done tonight is not the mistake of a moment. It is the reflection of a pattern. And it will not be ignored. The officer's breathing grew uneven, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the houses nearby, the curtains that had been moving. How many people had seen? How many had heard? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. It was a misunderstanding, he whispered weakly, as if saying the words could erase everything. The woman stepped closer, her presence commanding, her badge still visible in her hand. Threatening to destroy someone's life is not a misunderstanding. Demanding money is not a misunderstanding. Using fear as a weapon is not a misunderstanding. His knees felt weak beneath him. The certainty that had fueled his arrogance was gone, replaced with panic. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. He had chosen his words, and now those words had chosen his fate. The woman's calm voice carried the final blow. You threatened to end the life of the director of the FBI. Do you understand the seriousness of your actions now? His chest tightened, the reality of his situation striking him fully. For years, he had believed no one could touch him, that his position in the town gave him immunity. But standing before him was proof that the world was larger than his small corner, that power built on fear and corruption could crumble in a single moment. She straightened, tucking the badge back into her pocket, her eyes still fixed on him. You will answer for your actions, officer. And not to me alone. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. Please. I didn't mean, but she cut him off once again, her voice steady and final. You meant every word. You chose every threat. Now you will face the consequences. The flashing lights from his car continued to spin across the empty road, but in that moment, the true light was the truth revealed. The power he thought he had was gone, stripped away in an instant, leaving him small and shaken. The woman stood tall, her presence unbroken, her calmness shining brighter than ever. This was the turning point, the moment when arrogance collapsed under truth, when threats were silenced by real authority, and when the hunter realized he had always been the one standing in the trap. And as the town grew darker under the blanket of night, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same for the officer who had believed his badge gave him control. The road remained silent except for the faint hum of the police car's engine and the steady flash of its red and blue lights. The officer stood frozen, his face pale, his body stiff. The woman had just revealed the truth, that she was not an ordinary traveler, not a visitor to be bullied or silenced, but the director of the FBI. The weight of her words pressed down on him harder than any set of handcuffs ever could. His mind scrambled for excuses, for a way to undo the damage. But it was too late. Every word he had spoken, every threat he had made, now echoed back at him, louder and heavier than he could bear. She took a step back, pulling out her phone with calm precision. Her fingers moved swiftly, sending a short message. She did not raise her voice, she did not call for help in panic. Her control over the situation was so firm that even a few words sent through her phone were enough to change everything. The officer watched her, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, to plead, but his voice failed him. For the first time, he felt truly powerless. The authority he thought was unshakable had crumbled in seconds. Minutes later, the sound of engines filled the distance. Headlights appeared on the road, growing brighter as multiple black SUVs pulled up. The vehicles stopped smoothly, their doors opening in unison. From them stepped federal agents, their presence commanding, their movements practiced and efficient. The officer's eyes widened. He had seen federal agents only in movies, only in passing stories. Now they stood before him, their expressions calm but firm, their focus entirely on the woman he had just threatened. One of them approached her, speaking with respect. "Director, are you all right?" She gave a small nod. "I'm fine." "But he isn't." She turned her gaze toward the officer. The agents followed her eyes. In an instant, the officer who had once strutted with arrogance now stood trembling, his confidence gone. Two of the agents moved forward, their steps deliberate. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't rush. But their very presence was enough to strip away the last piece of false power he had clung to. "Sir," one agent said firmly. "You're going to need to put your hands where we can see them." The officer hesitated, his pride battling with his fear. His lips parted, as though he wanted to argue, but when he saw the look in the director's eyes, steady, unblinking, full of truth, he knew resistance was pointless. His shoulders slumped, and with shaky hands, he raised his arms. In moments, his wrists were cuffed. The same sound he had forced upon countless others now echoed for him, the cold click of steel locking into place. The irony was not lost on him. Neighbors who had been peeking through their curtains watched with wide eyes. For years, they had feared him. They had whispered about his actions but never dared to speak publicly. Now, as they saw him led away in handcuffs, a wave of quiet relief spread through the neighborhood. The man who had once used fear to control them was finally being exposed. One elderly man stepped onto his porch, his hands trembling as he leaned on his cane. He had lived in the town his whole life, and he had seen how this officer treated people. For years, he had stayed silent, afraid of what might happen if he spoke up. But now, seeing the FBI director herself standing tall, he felt courage returning to his voice. "It's about time," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But in that whisper was the echo of the entire town's relief. As the officer was guided toward one of the SUVs, he began to mutter excuses. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know. I didn't mean," his words stumbled, weak and hollow. The director turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "You meant every word you said tonight. And you've meant the same words on other nights, to other people. The only difference is that now, someone is here to hold you accountable." Her voice carried across the street, reaching not just the officer but the neighbors watching from behind their windows. For them, it was a message they had longed to hear, that the fear they had lived under could finally end. An agent opened the back door of the SUV and guided the officer inside. His head hung low, his arrogance shattered. For the first time, he realized that the badge he had once used as a weapon could no longer protect him. The director gave instructions to her team. "Search his records. Pull up his body camera footage. Interview the townspeople. I want every detail." "Yes, Director," One agent replied, already moving with purpose. The investigation began right there on the quiet street. Laptops were set up on the hoods of vehicles, files began to appear, and witnesses cautiously stepped forward. Neighbors who had once been silent now felt safe to speak. They told stories of intimidation, of false charges, of nights when people disappeared into holding cells without reason. Each story added weight to the officer's downfall. The director listened carefully, her expression thoughtful but firm. She did not gloat, she did not celebrate his arrest. For her, this was not about personal victory, it was about justice. It was about making sure that no one else would suffer under his abuse of power. As the evening grew darker, the flashing lights continued to illuminate the town. For once, those lights were not a symbol of fear but of hope. They meant that change had finally come. The officer sat silently in the back of the SUV, his mind replaying the moment she had shown her badge. The word director echoed in his head over and over, crushing him with its weight. He had thought he was untouchable. Now, he realized he was the smallest piece in a system much larger than him. Meanwhile, the townspeople whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others smiled quietly, tears in their eyes. A mother held her child close, whispering softly, "You see? Justice is real. Good people still fight for us." The director, standing in the center of it all, remained calm and steady. Her presence alone was enough to reassure those who watched. She had not come to punish, she had come to restore. One of the agents approached her again. "Director, we've found enough to move forward. His records are filled with complaints that were ignored. Witnesses are lining up. We'll take him to headquarters tonight." She nodded. "Good. Make sure every voice is heard. No one should be silenced again." The agents dispersed, carrying out her orders with efficiency. The townspeople slowly began to step outside, their fear fading. Some approached her, their eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," one woman whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "We thought no one would ever listen." The director placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your voices matter. They always did. Now they will be heard." The night air felt different now. Where fear had once lingered, hope was beginning to grow. The people of the town could feel it, the sense that the chains of silence had finally broken. As the SUVs prepared to leave, carrying the officer away, the director took one last look around. She saw the faces of people who had lived under fear, and she knew their lives would begin to change from this night forward. The officer had once believed he controlled this town. But in the end, it was the truth that controlled everything. And tonight, the truth had been set free. The night was quiet after the federal vehicles rolled out of the small town, their headlights disappearing into the distance. But the feeling they left behind was not silence, it was relief. For the first time in years, the people of that town felt like they could breathe freely. The man who had used fear as his shield and authority as his weapon was gone, taken away by the very system he had mocked. The director stood still on the side of the road, the soft night breeze touching her face. Her car was parked where the confrontation had begun, but now everything felt different. The flashing lights were no longer a sign of intimidation, they had become a symbol of justice. She looked around at the neighbors who had slowly gathered outside. Some stood on porches, others near the sidewalk, their eyes fixed on her. They had watched everything unfold, and in their faces, she saw both gratitude and uncertainty. One elderly woman stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her shawl, but her eyes were bright with courage. "We were afraid to speak," she whispered. "All these years, we thought no one would believe us." The director nodded gently. "I understand. Fear can silence even the strongest voices. But tonight, you were heard. And you will continue to be heard." A younger man stepped forward next, his voice heavy with emotion. "He made us believe he was untouchable. That no matter what we said, nothing would change. We gave up hope. The director's gaze softened. That's how people like him keep power. They convince others that resistance is useless. But the truth is stronger than fear. And when the truth comes forward, no one, not even someone with a badge, can stand against it. Her words carried in the quiet night, reaching every person listening. A little girl, holding her mother's hand, whispered softly, "She's not afraid, Mama." The mother bent down, kissed her child's hair, and replied, "That's because she knows what's right." The director did not smile, but her heart warmed at the sight of the child's eyes filled with hope. That was why she had chosen this life, why she had fought through obstacles and climbed higher than many believed she could. It wasn't for power, it was for moments like these, when people could see that justice was real. One of her agents approached, standing quietly by her side. "Director, everything is in motion. He will be processed, and the investigation will move quickly. The community will be included in every step." She gave a small nod. "Good. They deserve transparency." She turned back to the townspeople. "From this day forward, none of you should feel silenced again. If anyone threatens you, if anyone abuses their power, you must speak. There are always people who will listen." The people murmured among themselves, and slowly, the heavy shadow that had lingered over the town for so long began to lift. Some even smiled through tears, hugging their neighbors, whispering words of hope. The director took a step toward her car, but before she opened the door, she paused. She looked back at the faces watching her, their eyes filled with trust. She knew she could not leave without saying what needed to be said. "You must remember something important," she said, her voice firm but kind. "A badge does not make someone above the law. A uniform does not make someone untouchable. The law is meant to protect, not to harm. And when someone uses it wrongly, they must be held accountable. That is the promise of justice." Her words struck deep. People nodded slowly, their hearts opening to the truth she spoke. For so long, they had believed the badge on the officer's chest made him more powerful than their voices. Now they understood that true power was in fairness, in honesty, and in unity. The elderly man who had earlier whispered "It's about time" now stepped forward, his cane steady in his hand. "Thank you," he said clearly, his voice stronger than before. "You gave us back our courage." The director inclined her head respectfully. "You always had courage. Tonight, it simply found its way out again." With those words, she finally opened her car door and sat inside. She adjusted her seat belt with calm movements, but her mind was filled with reflection. She knew the road ahead for this town would not be easy. Wounds left by years of fear do not heal overnight. But they had taken the first step, and sometimes, that was enough to change everything. As she started the engine, she glanced once more at the people. Children clung to their parents, couples held hands, and neighbors stood together. Unity was already forming among them. The absence of fear had given them something greater: hope. Driving away slowly, she allowed herself a moment of quiet thought. Her life was filled with challenges, with constant battles against corruption and crime. But this encounter reminded her of the reason she had never given up. Justice was not just about catching criminals, it was about restoring faith, about showing people that integrity still existed in places where it seemed lost. The officer who had threatened her would face a trial. His past actions would be uncovered, his victims given a chance to speak. He would no longer hold power over anyone. But more importantly, the community he had once silenced had now found its voice. She imagined the little girl she had seen earlier, the one who whispered, "She's not afraid." That child would grow up remembering this night not as the night her town lived in fear, but as the night courage returned. And that thought alone gave the director peace. The road stretched before her, long and quiet, the stars beginning to shine above. She did not need applause, nor did she seek recognition. The satisfaction was in knowing that justice had prevailed, that lives had been changed. As she disappeared into the night, the town behind her slowly settled into rest. But its people would remember her words for years to come. They would teach their children that fear can be overcome, that power without justice is weakness, and that truth always finds a way to rise. The officer's downfall was not just his own story, it was a lesson for everyone. Authority must be paired with responsibility. Strength must be guided by fairness. And justice must never sleep. And so, the story ended not with anger, but with renewal. A community once trapped by silence was free again. A woman who carried the weight of a nation's trust had reminded them of their own strength. And together, their voices formed the final message.